King Charles shattered the global news cycle the moment he walked into the United Nations chamber uninvited. And tonight we're breaking down exactly why world leaders, diplomats, and even palace insiders are calling it the most destabilizing royal moment of the decade. If you're watching this, don't blink, because what unfolded inside that hall is already rewriting the monarchy's future, and missing a single detail means missing the start of a political earthquake no one saw coming. The day began like any other high-level summit, but according to aides who were in the room, everything changed the second Charles stepped through the doors, pale from exhaustion yet moving with a strange sense of finality. He wasn't scheduled, he wasn't expected, and as one insider whispered, he looked like a man walking toward confession, not diplomacy. That observation would prove painfully accurate. The murmurs died the moment he reached the podium. No prepared notes, no polished speech, just a trembling monarch staring directly at the leaders of the world, as if he had carried a secret for years and finally ran out of time to hide it. Then came the line that detonated across diplomatic cables within minutes. Britain owes the world not explanation, but healing. Delegates stiffened. Translators hesitated. Even seasoned journalists forgot their keyboards for a beat. This was not the cautious Charles the world recognized. This was something rawer, heavier, an unfiltered reckoning from a king who seemed desperate to place truth before tradition. And as analysts would quickly remark, he was not talking about geopolitics or protocol. Every syllable circled back to one figure he refused to name at first: Catherine. The woman he described as the conscience Britain had long ignored, the silent force carrying a moral clarity the palace once mistook for shyness. Diplomats exchanged loaded glances. Commentators on live feeds began to scramble. A senior European minister was overheard saying, "Is he elevating her or preparing us for something bigger?" The impact rippled instantly across London. Sources close to Buckingham Palace revealed that Charles's appearance triggered panic inside the communications office. Camilla's circle, described by insiders as blindsided and furious, rushed to formulate a response. One advisor allegedly asked, "Was this a planned declaration or an emotional collapse?" No one had an answer. Back inside the UN, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to awe as Charles continued, voice cracking under the weight of admission. He spoke of mistakes stretching back generations, of a monarchy that had observed far more than it had healed, and of a woman, Catherine, whose empathy had quietly done what diplomacy had failed to achieve. He called her Britain's heart, and those 3 words alone sparked a frenzy online. Trending tags exploded across social platforms within minutes, with commentators from Washington to Nairobi declaring that they had just witnessed a historic transfer of moral authority. But among the applause, a second narrative began to emerge, quieter but far more volatile. Analysts noted that the speech carried the unmistakable undertone of transition, not political transition, but symbolic transition, something deeper, even ideological. Charles wasn't just praising Catherine, he was positioning her, preparing a stage, shifting a crown without touching it. Behind the scenes, insiders described the palace's reaction as a crisis brewing in real time. Some aides aligned with William saw the moment as a visionary turning point. Others, particularly those close to Camilla, viewed it as a betrayal, one that could fracture the monarchy from the inside. The king left the podium to a standing ovation that felt less like approval and more like acknowledgement of a truth too long silenced. Cameras captured him stepping away with a haunted calm, as though he had finally set something in motion he could no longer stop. And that is where the real story begins. Because according to multiple diplomatic sources, Charles's speech was not a spontaneous act of emotion. It was the opening move of a plan crafted in secrecy, one that would soon drag the monarchy into its most dramatic upheaval in generations. And whether Catherine wanted it or not, she had just become the center of the world's most dangerous spotlight. Diplomats were still replaying Charles's trembling confession when the story took a darker, sharper turn. One no government, no newsroom, and certainly no royal office was prepared to handle. Within hours of the UN uproar, an envelope marked "Confidential, Diplomatic Eyes Only" quietly surfaced in the hands of council staff. And according to those who saw it first, the reaction was immediate. Faces drained, whispers intensified, and an emergency closed-door session was called before anyone even understood the scale of what they were holding. Multiple insiders confirmed to us that the dossier was not a random leak. It was deliberate, timed, targeted, and designed to detonate. What lay inside would not only support Charles's explosive speech, but escalate it into a global reckoning. One official described the document as a mirror the monarchy never intended for the world to see. Another called it a revelation wrapped as a threat. The contents painted a picture the public had never imagined. For years, Catherine had been quietly stepping into geopolitical spaces no royal spouse had ever entered. Spaces usually reserved for diplomats, hardened by decades of negotiations. According to the reports, she had served as an intermediary in stalled peace talks across the Middle East, assisted in brokering humanitarian corridors in war-torn territories, and intervened during moments when entire regions hovered on the brink of collapse. Not as a politician, not as a representative, but as a discreet moral presence, invited because, as one envoy reportedly wrote, "She listens before she speaks, and that alone disarms the room." These records weren't ceremonial summaries. They were detailed logs, private exchanges, handwritten notes, and late-night communications between leaders who had never publicly acknowledged her influence. One document described a session conducted after midnight, under risk of attack, where Catherine's calm intervention prevented negotiations from breaking apart. Another memo reported that her guidance facilitated safe passage for dozens of children during a siege that never made headline news. It was the kind of material that reshaped reputations, alliances, and power structures in a single sweep, and it explained why Charles's words earlier that day felt less like praise and more like unveiling. Sources who reviewed the dossier told us Catherine's involvement had been intentionally concealed to prevent politicization and, crucially, to protect her from being weaponized by competing factions. But that secrecy had shattered, and once exposed, every page served as both vindication and provocation. While diplomats inside the UN chamber were stunned into silence, London erupted into chaos. Palace staff reportedly scrambled to determine whether the leak originated from a foreign government, an internal defector, or, as one senior aide cryptically suggested, a faction that believes the monarchy must be redefined by force, not tradition. Theories multiplied as fast as headlines. Commentators speculated that the document was too clean, too curated to be an accident. Analysts questioned whether this was exposure or elevation, and insiders admitted quietly that the dossier carried the precision of a calculated political strike. Camilla's office reacted with what several sources described as unmistakable fury. According to one insider, the Queen Consort immediately convened her communications team, demanding answers on how Catherine had amassed such influence without oversight. Another source insisted she saw the leak as the ultimate act of betrayal, believing it undermined her own standing more aggressively than any scandal she had ever faced. Meanwhile, Catherine, the woman at the center of the storm, remained silent. No statement, no appearance, no denial. Her absence only magnified the drama. Analysts claimed her silence projected strength. Critics argued it created more questions. Supporters called it dignified, but palace insiders whispered something far more unsettling. She didn't know this was coming. If true, it would mean Catherine had been dragged into the spotlight by a force outside her control, perhaps even outside the palace's control. By evening, the dossier had become the story, overshadowing Charles's speech and sparking diplomatic shockwaves. Governments demanded clarification. Media outlets rushed emergency panels. Academics dissected every page line by line. And for the first time in decades, monarchic influence became the center of global policy debate. But the most remarkable shift occurred inside the UN chamber itself. Delegates who had been confused hours earlier were now unified in a single conclusion. Charles's speech had not been an emotional outburst. It was groundwork. It was strategy. It was preparation for something colossal. One ambassador, who requested anonymity, summarized the mood with chilling accuracy. The leak wasn't meant to destroy Catherine. It was meant to justify her. Someone wants her elevated. Officially. And with that realization, the atmosphere changed from intrigue to inevitability. The world wasn't just reacting anymore. It was positioning itself, lobbying, preparing. Because the dossier didn't simply reveal what Catherine had done, it revealed what she could become. And tonight, according to multiple high-ranking insiders, the question wasn't whether nations would support her rise. The real question was who orchestrated the leak and what they expect in return. The shockwaves from the leaked dossier were still spreading across continents when delegates at the United Nations made a move that even seasoned analysts weren't prepared to see unfold in real time. By the following morning, the atmosphere inside the assembly building had shifted from disbelief to something far more decisive. As one insider described it to us, the room felt like history waiting to be signed. And for the first time since Charles's seismic speech, nations that rarely agreed on anything, security, climate, trade, were suddenly aligned on one extraordinary proposition. Behind closed doors, representatives from nearly 200 countries convened an unscheduled emergency session. The agenda was simple in words but unfathomable in implication. Discuss Catherine's unexpected moral authority and determine whether the global system should formalize it. Multiple diplomats confirmed that whispers of a potential vote had begun circulating before dawn, triggered by a chain of late-night calls between leaders who viewed the dossier not as a scandal, but as an opportunity. According to an ambassador from South America, everyone sensed the shift. It wasn't a question of whether she had influence, it was whether the world would dare legitimize it. That's when momentum accelerated. Delegates reviewed the leaked documents again and again, tracing Catherine's quiet interventions from conflict zones to humanitarian corridors. Some described her as a stabilizing force. Others painted her as an unexpected diplomatic bridge. A few warned that institutionalizing her role could set a dangerous precedent. But even the skeptics acknowledged the same reality. The public reaction had turned her into a global figure overnight, and ignoring that shift would carry political costs no nation wanted to bear. By midday, what began as a discussion evolved into a formal proposal. The Council drafted a resolution titled Appointment of Her Majesty Catherine as Global Peace Representative, an unprecedented step that would position a member of the British royal family not as a national figure, but as a global moral delegate. That title alone sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Insiders near the drafting table said the conversation grew tense, emotional, and at times combative. Nations long critical of the British Crown hesitated. Representatives from former colonies demanded assurances that this move wasn't a veiled attempt to rehabilitate imperial legacy. And several European ministers privately expressed concern that elevating a single figure might undermine institutional systems altogether. But something unusual happened, something analysts are still struggling to explain. One by one, the dissenting voices softened. As one diplomat described it, the dossier didn't present Catherine as a monarch, it presented her as a mediator. And morality is currency no nation can afford to ignore. Another added, she represented the humanity institutions have lost. It was that sentiment, not politics, not alliances, that tipped the scales. Meanwhile, in London, panic intensified. Parliament was blindsided. Government ministers scrambled to coordinate statements, only to realize they had none. According to a Westminster source, phones rang non-stop with one recurring question: who authorized this? The answer, of course, was no one. And that was the problem. The monarchy had always been a national institution. This was the first time in modern history that the world was elevating a royal figure without Britain's consent. Back at the United Nations, the tension inside the chamber thickened as the vote approached. Delegates consulted their governments. Advisors huddled in corners. Security increased. Journalists fired rapid updates into a global audience, watching the situation unfold like a geopolitical thriller. Even veteran analysts admitted they had never seen the council move with this level of urgency or emotional clarity. Then came the moment that would define the century. Representatives rose, one after another, casting their votes aloud. Nations, fractured by decades of mistrust, suddenly found themselves united under an unexpected moral banner. According to multiple sources in the room, a ripple of stunned silence followed when the tally appeared on the large display. Not a slim majority, not a divided outcome. A resounding, overwhelming confirmation. Within seconds, applause erupted. Loud, unrestrained, and startlingly emotional. The chamber, known for its cold diplomacy and rigid protocol, broke into genuine celebration. Some delegates wiped their eyes, others shook their heads in disbelief, and several long-time UN observers said the atmosphere felt almost spiritual, as though the room collectively acknowledged a turning point beyond politics. But outside that moment of unity, a storm was brewing. Analysts immediately questioned what this meant for global power structures. Critics asked whether the world had just handed influence to a woman whose role, however compassionate, fell outside traditional governance. Supporters hailed it as a rebirth of moral leadership, and palace insiders, they braced for impact. One aide put it bluntly, "This isn't a title, it's a new throne." As the resolution spread across the world, the symbolism became impossible to ignore. The global community had made its decision, not through treaties or pressure campaigns, but through faith. Faith in empathy, faith in conscience, faith in Catherine. Yet even in the midst of this unprecedented unity, a quieter, more ominous truth surfaced among the diplomatic whispers. The vote may have elevated Catherine, but it also awakened a volatile force inside Buckingham Palace. Because power, especially power granted by the world, never enters without a fight. And tonight, the monarchy was about to learn just how costly that spotlight could become. The applause from the United Nations chamber had barely faded when the backlash ignited in London, not slowly, not quietly, but with the precision of a blow that had been waiting for the right moment to land. While global headlines celebrated Catherine as the newly anointed moral compass of modern diplomacy, the atmosphere inside Clarence House shifted into something far more volatile. According to one senior aide, the moment the vote went global, the temperature in Camilla's wing dropped to freezing. The Queen Consort, already stung by Charles's emotional speech and the dossier's revelations, reportedly watched the UN broadcast in stunned silence before rising from her chair and declaring to her team, "He's handed her my legacy." Those words, according to an insider present, set the tone for the next 24 hours. What followed was not panic, it was counter-offensive. Camilla's communications advisors launched into immediate damage control. Their objective was not to attack Catherine directly, public sympathy was far too strong, but to reframe the narrative surrounding her sudden global rise. One consultant close to the strategy described it as a delicate deflection. Subtle whispers began to circulate through media-friendly corridors, questioning whether Catherine's appointment risked politicizing the monarchy, asking if the UN had been influenced by emotionalism rather than policy, and hinting, without evidence, at the possibility that the leak of the dossier had been strategically timed. It was classic palace maneuvering, soft shadows instead of overt blows. But observers quickly noticed the fingerprints. As one insider from Kensington Palace remarked, "You can see the lines. You can see who benefits from the doubt." While Camilla orchestrated her media counterstrike, another crisis emerged. The split within the palace staff. Aides aligned with Charles and William were calling the sequence of events visionary, insisting privately that Catherine's new role represented a generational shift the monarchy desperately needed. But those loyal to Camilla saw the global vote as a hostile takeover, one that risked diminishing the Queen Consort's stature, not just symbolically, but structurally. A senior staffer described the tension as an invisible civil war. Corridors once filled with polite formality now echoed with whispers of resentment, confusion, and quiet panic. Some aides reportedly avoided eye contact with colleagues from rival factions. Others began discreetly asking which office they should continue reporting to. As one longtime royal employee put it, "For the first time, we're not sure who holds the real center of gravity." William, according to sources close to him, found himself trapped between loyalty and momentum. He supported his wife wholeheartedly, yet he understood the political cost of the UN's decision. "He knows this changes everything," one insider said. "Not just for Catherine, but for the institution he will eventually lead." Even his supporters admitted privately that any move he made now could be interpreted as either allegiance or betrayal. Meanwhile, Catherine's silence became its own storyline. She made no public comment, issued no statement, and refused all requests for interviews. Analysts debated whether the silence was strategic or emotional. Supporters praised it as dignity. Critics claimed it was evasive. But palace insiders offered a different explanation entirely. She was blindsided. She's still processing what they've turned her into. Back at Clarence House, Camilla's frustration deepened as global coverage continued painting Catherine as a humanitarian icon and her as a fading figure in a drama she could no longer control. Her allies pushed harder, reaching out to editorial contacts and subtly shifting tone. Commentaries began to appear questioning whether a royal should hold a global diplomatic mandate. One columnist even asked whether emotional leadership was replacing experienced governance. A line palace insiders insist came straight from Camilla's camp. But even as her faction gained traction in the press, public sentiment refused to sway. Polls across the country showed overwhelming support for Catherine. Comment threads overflowed with comparisons to Diana. Editorials praised her compassion while describing Camilla as out of step with the new era. And that, according to one former court official, was the true breaking point. Camilla knows how fast the tide can turn. She lived through Diana's shadow. This time, she sees the shadow forming again, and she can't outrun it. The pressure intensified behind palace doors. Reports emerged of icy exchanges between Charles and Camilla. One aide described nights of long silences, punctuated by sharp remarks. Another quoted Camilla saying, "You've made her untouchable." Charles reportedly responded, "This is bigger than us." That line, leaked within hours, spread across global media, adding fuel to the narrative of a palace in open fracture. By late evening, the damage was no longer confined to private hallways. Public speculation rose. Royal analysts noted a dramatic shift in institutional tone. Parliament demanded a briefing. And for the first time, the monarchy's internal conflict became the centerpiece of international news. Yet amid the chaos and the power struggle, something even more dangerous was brewing. Something not orchestrated by Camilla, not guided by Charles, and not controlled by the palace machinery. A whisper about a scandal, a leak involving personal correspondence, a revelation powerful enough to reshape the public's understanding of Catherine completely. And according to multiple insiders, the source of that scandal was someone no one had expected. The scandal didn't break with sirens or headlines. It arrived as a whisper, one that drifted through diplomatic corridors, newsroom group chats, and royal offices like a storm cloud ready to burst. By dawn, that whisper crystallized into something far more explosive. A leaked personal letter written by Catherine herself. And according to senior insiders, the moment the palace caught wind of it, everyone knew the narrative was about to flip. The letter wasn't political. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't curated by advisors or filtered through palace handlers. It was raw. It was human. And it was never meant to be seen by the world. Yet now it lay in the hands of journalists, analysts, and commentators who understood exactly what they were holding. The emotional blueprint of the woman the world had just elevated to near mythical moral status. Sources say the letter was written the night before the UN vote, hours before Catherine became the most discussed woman on the planet. Its tone wasn't triumphant. It wasn't even confident. It was hesitant, vulnerable, almost frightened. In one line she wrote, "Peace is not a title, it is a burden I carry for every child who never knew safety." In another, she confessed the loneliness that accompanies global admiration. They see symbols, they do not see how hard it is to breathe beneath them. That single sentence ricocheted through media networks worldwide. Journalists who initially prepared to dissect the letter as a potential scandal found themselves disarmed. Analysts who expected a tactical PR pivot instead read the confessions of a woman who felt the weight of global expectation pressing against her ribs. Within minutes of publication, commentators were calling the letter the most honest royal document of the century. Even hardened political reporters admitted privately that it was difficult not to be moved, but inside the palace, the reaction was anything but emotional. It was panic. Camilla's camp, according to multiple insiders, went from anticipatory satisfaction to visible alarm. They had expected the leak to raise questions about Catherine's readiness. Instead, it did the opposite. The vulnerability made her more beloved. The humanity made her more credible. One staff member from Clarence House summed it up bluntly. It backfired. Spectacularly. Public support didn't just hold, it surged. Polls skyrocketed. Editorials praised Catherine for showing more honesty in a single letter than most leaders show in entire careers. Commentators described her not as a symbol of perfection, but as a reflection of the world's struggle, a woman confronting the impossible and refusing to turn away. And in that shift, the battle lines within the monarchy solidified. Catherine wasn't just the world's chosen representative anymore. She became a mirror of collective grief, hope, and endurance. That narrative, organic, emotional, untouchable, was something no palace strategist could manufacture and no rival could dismantle. But the letter also unsettled a different set of people, the monarchy's traditional power brokers. According to a longtime court observer, they don't know how to handle someone whose influence grows through vulnerability, not authority. It breaks every rule they operate by. Behind closed doors, meetings intensified. There were urgent discussions about containment strategies, public tone adjustments, and how to maintain the monarchy's institutional image without appearing to suppress Catherine's authenticity. One advisor confessed, "If we push back, we look cruel. If we embrace it, she becomes bigger than the crown." Meanwhile, Catherine remained silent. No clarification. No explanation, no denial. A senior Kensington aide said she was hurt but unsurprised, admitting Catherine had always feared that private emotions could someday be weaponized, even unintentionally. Yet the global response told a different story. The world wasn't weaponizing her vulnerability, it was absorbing it, echoing it, turning it into a movement bigger than monarchy, politics, or tradition. And that is what terrified the power players inside the palace the most. Because the leak didn't weaken Catherine, it liberated her image from the institution entirely. She no longer belonged to the monarchy, she belonged to the world. And just as royal officials scrambled to regain control, Charles made a move no one expected, one that would drag every buried truth back into the light and force the monarchy into the most consequential reckoning of its modern existence. The palace had barely recovered from the shock of Catherine's letter when Charles stepped forward with a revelation that would collapse whatever remained of the monarchy's old foundations. This wasn't a televised address. It wasn't a carefully staged photo call. It happened in a private chamber, witnessed only by a select circle of senior aides. Yet within hours, every word was racing through diplomatic channels and royal corridors like a controlled explosion. According to multiple insiders, Charles's expression that morning was unlike anything they had seen. Not defeated, not fragile, resolved. As one advisor put it, he looked like a man who had made his peace with the storm. And then came the moment that shifted the entire trajectory of the royal institution. He revealed the truth about Queen Elizabeth's final request. Not a speech, not a document, a whispered instruction given in the final hours of her life. Let the one who restores peace reign in the hearts of the world. For years, he had carried it alone, a private compass, a burden he believed he had already failed to honor. But after the UN vote, after the dossier, after Catherine's letter, he finally understood what the late Queen had seen long before anyone else, that Catherine's strength was not political, it was moral. And moral leadership, as Charles explained, was the only thing that could carry the monarchy into a world fractured by conflict and fatigue. A silence reportedly fell over the room as Charles spoke of regret. Regret for allowing tradition to outrank conscience, for letting the institution define compassion instead of the reverse. He admitted that watching Catherine shoulder the emotional weight of global suffering had forced him to confront what leadership should look like, not what it had always been. Those present described his tone as both confessional and liberating, the voice of a monarch finally willing to surrender control not to weakness, but to clarity. Then came the announcement that would eclipse every headline of the past year, his intention to withdraw from active sovereign duties. Not in scandal, not in disgrace, but in deliberate fulfillment of a promise that began with Elizabeth and would end with the rise of a new moral era. Insiders say Catherine was stunned, urging him to reconsider, but Charles simply replied, "This was never about the crown. It was about the world finding its balance again." That single sentence, according to one witness, left even the most seasoned courtiers unable to speak. The news spread instantly. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Editorials framed it as the most dignified abdication of modern times. Nations released statements praising Charles for choosing purpose over power. And Catherine, now the global face of peace, found herself standing on the threshold of a mantle shaped not by lineage, but by conscience. Camilla, sources say, withdrew from public view entirely. The power struggle that once consumed the palace evaporated overnight, replaced by the overwhelming certainty of a new era unfolding in real time. As candles were lit across London and beyond, it became clear what the world had witnessed. Not the fall of a monarchy, but its rebirth. Not the end of an institution, but its awakening. Sometimes, peace doesn't wear armor. It wears a crown built from empathy. Thank you for watching. If you want to follow every twist, revelation, and turning point in this unfolding royal transformation, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. The story is far from over.